Record. Okay. Welcome, everybody. It's good to have so many people here. We, the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, are really thrilled to be able to sponsor this program for you. My name is David Kramer. I'm director of the library. And for those of you who come along on other kinds of programs, our most common sort of presentation is book talks. But we also do other kinds of programming, and we recognize that many of you are missing your occasions to travel because of the pandemic. So we thought we would take an opportunity to find a really exceptional guide, Professor Marina Rustow, who will take us on a tour of medieval Cairo. But she wisely responded to my invitation by saying, you know what, people coming from the 21st century probably need a little bit of guidance before they drop themselves into medieval Cairo. It's not a place that will come naturally to modern sensibility. So this is going to be a kind of survival guide for all of us. Professor Rustow is, as you know, from the promotions, professor of Jewish history and civilization at Princeton University and the head of their Genizah project. And I might add, a good friend, and it's really a pleasure to be able to sponsor her for this occasion. Please do leave yourselves on mute, and after Marina's presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, but given the number of people, we're not going to be able to accommodate verbal questions. What I'll ask you to do is to throw your questions into chat, which you'll find on the bottom part of your screen, and I will, kind of work my way through the questions that come up, and obviously we won't have a chance to deal with all of them, but I'll try to get some representative questions, and that's where we'll go from here. So I hope you will enjoy this program very much. I am going to spotlight Marina so that you can all see her well, and she will share her screen with us as she leads us through the tour. So have a wonderful experience.
300 participants.
Okay, and Marina, you have to unmute yourself.
We're up to.
Hello, and thank you all for being here and for allowing me into your homes and into your evenings or afternoons or whatever time of day it is where you are. I am a social historian of the Middle East, so I want to say a little bit about what that actually means before beginning the tour. It means that I try to understand history from below, history on a small scale, what's sometimes called microhistory, material culture, the world of the everyday. Historians have been doing this in the region that I study for maybe 3 generations, and it's going reasonably well, but it can be an uphill slog because the sources that tend to get copied also tend to be written by wealthy men like rulers and state officials or religious specialists. Now, I have nothing against understanding male elites. It's very important in history to understand male elites, but focusing on them to the exclusion of others skews our ideas about the past because we're ignoring half of society, of course, women, but then also the other 70 or 80% of the rest, the illiterate, those living at subsistence level, the rural, and the poor. Historians of the Middle East before 1500 tend to prefer elites, while social historians prefer the voiceless classes. So how then can a social historian of the Middle East before 1500 find information about the voiceless classes? One way is by looking at documents. So I'm using the term documents the way historians talk about documentary sources as distinct from literary sources. So letters, legal deeds, lists, accounts, and anything else that wasn't meant for posterity, where a literary source, I sometimes call them long form sources, sort of written on speakerphone versus something that you're eavesdropping on. Documents are still written sources, but they tend to have a texture of the everyday precisely because nobody meant for them to be preserved. Another way of understanding history from below is by studying material culture, not just looking at objects from the past, or not just looking at objects from the past, but also trying to recreate them. because recreating them helps you understand how anyone could possibly make them under pre-industrial conditions when you can figure it out, and you can't always, which also teaches you something, that there are complex forms of craftsmanship that you simply had to start learning as a small child, or you wouldn't be able to do them at all. In our world, there are actually very few of these crafts left. Perhaps writing with a pen is one of them. Musical instruments is another. And I'll be returning to this in a bit. So all of this has led me to some experimentation in the classroom. For the past 4 years, I've taught a course at Princeton called Medieval Cairo, a Survival Guide, in which students read lots of documents alongside other sources, but also try to recreate objects. I have to say that never have I felt as much as I did last spring when I taught the class, that I get paid to engage in a historically grounded form of escapism and to teach others to do the same. So I'm approaching the point now where I want to write down what I've learned from teaching this class in perhaps a small book. So your questions will be very helpful for me in guiding my research. I won't have the answers to all of them tonight, but I will consider them carefully. And if we don't have time to get to them in the exchange later, I will read through all of them when I get the transcript of the Q&A. If you ever plan on living in Cairo in the year 1000, there are some things that you should know. You won't have to think about breakfast. You'll eat in the late morning and the late afternoon, 2 meals a day, and you won't have to cook unless you're getting paid to do it. You'll buy your meals at the bazaar, warm, and carry them home in a portable meal carrier. Why, you ask? Because the last place you want to build a fire is your house. Your house is 1/24th or some equally absurd fraction of what's called a dar in Arabic, a multi-story residential compound arranged around a courtyard. So having an open fire there, which you would need to do in order to cook, risks incinerating yourself and your neighbors, assuming that incinerating your neighbors isn't something that you want to do, but I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so what if you have no neighbors because you own the entire dar? In that case, you're wealthy enough to have a kitchen and a staff to use it, so you still don't cook, and congratulations, you get room service. Either way, you won't cook at home, and you won't cook at all unless it's your job to cook, with one exception, and that is bread. Your courtyard may have at its center a domed mud brick oven, a tannour, where you and your neighbors can bake bread. Try to stay on friendly terms with them, which won't always be easy since your neighbors are likely to be your in-laws, which brings me to why you'd want to incinerate them. The surviving documentation suggests that in-laws could be invasive and controlling. This is very specific to the Middle Ages, as you can imagine. If you had wise aunties or powerful uncles who took control of your marriage negotiations, however, your in-laws could be legally obliged to stay out of your business. If not, well, you can always bring your dough to the communal oven or buy it from the baker shop in the bazaar. But if you're lucky, you'll have good clauses in your marriage contract, like this woman who took her husband to court because she had no intention of divorcing him, mind you, but she took her husband to court because her in-laws were driving her crazy, especially the female ones, her husband's mother and sisters, who get a special shout out in this legal document. This is a court record. Why we have it, I'll mention in a moment. It's from 1119 CE. It's written in Judeo-Arabic, so Arabic in Hebrew characters. And at the time of the marriage, the groom, whose name is Abul Hassan Shlomo HaKohen ben Menashe, took upon himself an obligation regarding his wife, which is if she hated living with his sisters and his mother, he would be obligated to move her and provide her housing in a detached place to herself away from them. However, when it was some months after the marriage, words passed between her, meaning the wife, and his sister. This is like kind of wonderful in the original because it's very laconic. It's jarra bainaha wa bain khawatiha kalam, literally speech passed between them. And we all know what kind of speech and don't have to ask. So she therefore requested relocation and separation from them according to the stipulations to which he had agreed for her sake. So she and her husband move out together, but alas, then her husband becomes brokenhearted upon separation from his female relatives, the poor dear. Oh, and also the rent was too much for him, or so he claimed. And they agreed to live under the same roof as family again, the same roof with his family again. But because of her marriage stipulations, which are upheld in the document before you, she could have her own separate apartment in the Dar. And his mother and his sisters would not be allowed to enter her apartment, even to take a matchstick from her. I think I advanced too early. Yes. So the place of your wife will be detached from them, and she will have the ability to act freely in her home without their presence, in preparation of her food and in her expenditures and in whatever else she needs, without interacting with them in any way. You may ask, did the arrangement work? Well, that depends what you mean by work. The couple stayed married, but they also went back to court 16 years later, when another legal document that has survived reveals that he's now sold her domestic servant out from under her, which would have consigned her to quite a bit of housework, which, given that these are probably pretty well-off people, she must not have been very happy about. So she took him to court again, and to compensate her, he had to give her his own domestic servant. This is, by the way, the same court scribe who drew up both agreements at 16 years distance from each other. And I'd like to know what the words were that came out of his mouth when they came through the door of his court again 16 years later. Okay, so how do we know all this? We know all this because of the Cairo Genizah. Now, what I'm talking to you about is not actually technically Cairo, because in the period from which most of the documentation comes, which is the 11th and 12th centuries, Cairo was not a residential city. It was actually a palatine compound. So only the rulers and their various government offices were located in Cairo, and where most people lived was the residential core of the later metropolis of Cairo, which is called Fustat. So here's Fustat in the south, and here's Fatimid Cairo in the north. Both are walled cities, and actually many of the walls still survive. This is an inset map of Fustat, where you can see there are some buildings in yellow. Those are Christian churches, most of them from the Middle Ages, and they survive. And the blue building is the Benezer Synagogue, and that was where the Cairo Genizah survived. This is the interior of the Benezer, but it's not the Benezer as it looked in the Middle Ages or even in the 19th century, because it was rebuilt completely in the 1880s and 1890s. Nonetheless, the eyewitnesses from the late 19th century tell us that it was rebuilt exactly on the footprint of the old building. So assuming that it's a reasonable facsimile of the old one, if you go along the Ezrat Nashim, the women's section, on the left-hand side to what is the front wall of the synagogue, you'll see that there is a very small opening in the wall, and that was where synagogue officials would have deposited any documents or literary texts that were used and couldn't be used anymore. Genizah research it's been going on for more than 100 years now, but it's evolved particularly rapidly in the last 60 or 70 years, thanks to Shlomo Dov Goitein, who died in 1985. I am a student of Goitein, and I have students of my own. So we're now on G4 or maybe G5 of documentary Genizah studies. Because of the sort of, capillary nature of academic advising, that means that it's evolving particularly rapidly now, which is wonderful and like such a pleasure to be involved with this. The dates of most of the material that we have from the Cairo Genizah are between 950 and 1250. Now, that's not everything. So there are significant pockets of material from later, especially from the Ottoman period. And there the languages multiply. So instead of mostly Hebrew and Aramaic and Judeo-Arabic, you also have Ladino, some Ottoman Turkish, some Italian, lots of fun stuff. And that's the part of the Genizah that the post-1500 part that mostly has been ignored, and that's starting to change finally. Now, just in the last few years, we have a critical mass of people working on the later Genizah, what Goitein used to dismiss as late, meaning not interesting, but it is interesting. Nonetheless,
Marina, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. I'm getting a few messages from people saying that they can't see the share screen, but others seem to be saying they are. I mean, can many of you see this? I get to see it just fine. Okay,
you have
thank
to
you.
push the button that says screen share.
No, the screen share is. Can you see the screen share, Michael?
I can. I see the graphics.
It
Okay.
could also be because of the way you have the windows arranged, so you can play with the arrangement of the windows and see if that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So
This,
I mean,
I should also add, this was a
Yeah.
dark slide. It's going to get brighter.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead. I mean, as long as everything. Okay. Yeah, we're doing okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry for the interruption.
No problem at all. And yes, if there are any technical glitches, please don't hesitate to stop the action, because that is very frustrating. Okay, so the grand total, as far as we know, of what was preserved in the Genizah is about 400,000 pages or fragments of pages. Now, nobody's ever sat there and counted, but that's our best estimate based on a lot of different considerations, including numbers of shelf marks and also numbers of digital images. So digital imaging over the last 20 years has enabled us to get a much more accurate count of the Genizah. So of this 400,000, the vast majority are what I called earlier literary texts. So texts that are meant for posterity. I'm putting books in quotation marks because the book could actually take many physical forms in the Middle Ages. Many of you will know about the scroll because you've been to synagogues. That's the horizontal scroll, but there were also vertical scrolls. And in addition to what medievalists would call the codex, which is the book as we know it today, with a spine and covers and two-sided pages in between, there were also pamphlets, and pamphlets were in fact much more common than full-sized codices. So that's most of what we have from the Genizah. That leaves about 10% documentary sources. Now, 40,000 or 10% might not seem like a lot compared to 400,000, but Goitein used to estimate 10 to 15,000 documents. When he started out, he estimated 10,000, then he went up to 15,000. When I started out, I estimated 20,000, and that felt like heretical and unfounded. And now we actually have 30,000 entries in the Princeton Genizah Project database, and I assume that we haven't covered everything. So that's a sense of the size of everything. All of this material has been scattered across more than 60 libraries and private collections, which is a whole fascinating story that I'm not going to tell tonight. The majority of the material is at the Cambridge University Library, and JTS has the second largest collection of Genizah fragments in the world. If you want to know more about why that is, read this book, Sacred Trash, by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole, which is a wonderful read. It came out in 2011 and saved the rest of us an enormous amount of labor, because we weren't going to write the book about the collection of the Genizah in the 19th and 20th century, but they did, and they did an absolutely fantastic job of it.
And Marina, you've got to correct your graphic. We know from digitization that we've got 43,000 fragments.
Really? So
yes.
So the 32,000 I think is shelf marks, because Cambridge, so it's interesting, Cambridge has, see if I can get back to the graphic, there it is. Cambridge has 120,000 shelf marks, but it has 200,000 folio pages. So 43 is good, because I've been saying 40,000, and when I saw like the graphic, I said, did I get this wrong at some point? So that's excellent. Okay, so that's kind of where the stuff is now. That dispersal was permanent as of 1897, but there's been a more recent temporary dispersal for which this lecture marks an endpoint, a siyum. And that is that in 2015, when the JTS Library went under renovation, its Genizah fragments, thanks to David's how shall I put it, forbearance, generosity, insanity, I don't know, one of these things, maybe all of them, sent the Genizah fragments for JTS on a 5-year vacation to Firestone Library at Princeton University. So this is a photo of David with Don Thornbury, head of technical services for special collections at Princeton. David is looking with consternation into the hollow of a moving truck where the Genizah fragments were about to go. They made it safely. And they made it safely back. So for the last 5 years, what that means is that I've been able to work with a team at Princeton to trawl the collection for documentary sources that no one had studied or even identified before. On this team, there were some very, very fine scholars on whose work I've drawn in preparing this presentation. Amir Ashur from Tel Aviv University, Alan Elbaum, who is a medical student and who is with us tonight, but he's taking a vacation from medical school to trawl the Cairo Genizah, and he is, I've referred to him many times as our secret weapon at the Genizah lab, incredibly prolific identifier and transcriber and translator of Genizah documents. My colleague Eve Krakowski in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, and Odette Zinger, who has both a BA and a PhD from Princeton and now teaches at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So these are some of the core team members that have worked on the JTS material. Okay, so now that you know how I know all this, I'm gonna resume the tour. So here's another thing you should know if you ever plan on living in medieval Cairo. It's extremely important that you not try to carve rock crystal unless you've been trained to do so. Rock crystal is a type of quartz that you and everyone else in Cairo covets for its flawless transparency. And you won't have been trained to carve rock crystal unless you were trained to do it as a child, shortly after learning how to walk and talk. So here's how that goes. Let's say your uncle runs a rock crystal carving workshop. He'll send one of his trading partners on a sea voyage to buy hunks of rock crystal. There were quartz mines in South Asia, in East Africa, and possibly in Central Asia. So let's go with South Asia, since it's on a trade route that's very well documented in the Genizah. There were quartz mines in Sri Lanka, which medieval Arabs called Ceylon, which is where Ceylon comes from. So contrary to popular belief and contrary to Wikipedia, Ceylon is not a colonial era name. So your uncle's trading partner is going to do something like this. He's going to set out on his journey in or near Fustat, and he's going to sail up the Nile to Kos, walk overland to the Red Sea, hit a number of Red Sea ports, and then finally when he gets to Aden in South Arabia, he is going to hit open water after changing boats. And the reason he's able to sail through open water is the monsoon winds. So assuming it's the proper half of the monsoon season, he's gonna be going in the right direction and sail on open water to Gujarat and then south and east to Ceylon, where he will hopefully buy a gleaming hunk of rock crystal. So the monsoon winds make sailing easy and efficient, but don't be mistaken, this will not be a pleasant voyage for him. A trader around 1100 grumbled about the voyage to India in Judeo-Arabic so passionately that he felt compelled to do it in rhyme. So he's going to name all of those Red Sea ports that you just saw on the slide that I showed you. Only he's going to think of rhymes for them. So he says, I arrived in Aidab, which is truly a city of tribulations, which in Arabic is Adab. We arrived at a city called Sawakin, which is really a most frightening place, Akhad Amakin. Then we arrived at a city called Badih, the one that cuts, for it is just as the name says, the most bitter, frightening, miserable of places. Then we arrived at a place called Dahlak. This is the Dahlak archipelago, which housed one of the greatest ports that he would pass through on his journey. The following adage is said about it, but you surpass them all. It is a ruinous land, Balad Muhlik. So whether because the customs tolls were extortionate or he just didn't like the food, we'll never know. But his difficulties were only beginning, because our whining Libyan, once he left the Red Sea, tells us that he had to embark on a different type of ship, which he says contained not a single nail of iron, but rather was tied together with ropes. May God protect us with his shield. In fact, this was actually how Indian Ocean ships were built. The planks were tied together with ropes that were spun from coconut coir, and coconut coir rope actually resists seawater quite nicely. It was and still is used to tie planks of boats together and also as ropes for rigging. But you have no reason to know that if you're a Mediterranean man who sailed only on boats with nails, and you'd probably be frightened out of your wits. Okay, so back to your uncle's trade partner who's not having fun on his voyage. It would take him 2 years minimum to return from Ceylon because of those monsoon winds. Anyone who made it to India and back in a year was considered to be a little bit reckless and also probably hadn't done enough trading to make the journey worthwhile, but not so your uncle's partner. He's been there for 2 years and he's got an impressive cargo to show for his trip with gleaming hunks of clear quartz. Okay, so what are you gonna do with this quartz? The hardness of rock crystal rates at a 7 on the Mohs scale. So you need something harder to carve it with. Diamond is a good bet. And even with a diamond tool or diamond powder ground in with a metal lathe, it would take hundreds of hours to shape rock crystal. So first you make the rough cut, and then you hollow out the vessel without breaking it, please, or your uncle is going to throw you out of the shop. And then you hand it off to one of the more experienced artisans to carve the surface, which is the part where the bravura comes in. So to carve the surface, you use a bow, like an archery bow or the bow of a string instrument, and the bow turns the rod that turns the lathe, and the lathe has to move fast or no friction against the rock crystal. So I'll just let that sink in for a moment. This is something like using a violin bow to operate a potter's wheel, and it's about as awkward. So this is what the process looked like in a South Asian manuscript from around 1600. And this is what it looked like when my students tried it last February, right before the pandemic hit. In fact, it might have been our catastrophically unsuccessful efforts to carve rock crystal that actually caused the pandemic in the first place. Although this group, I have to say, did get further than the group the year before. But I hasten to add that it was a planned failure, because nothing gives one respect for the artistic prowess of medieval craftspeople like attempting to reproduce their work. It's at this point in the class that my students usually realize that medieval Egypt was a technologically complex society, a far cry from the European Middle Ages depicted in Monty Python movies. So I can confirm from hard personal experience what you know from your uncle's shop, that turning rock crystal into anything recognizable requires two things: uncommon upper body strength and equally uncommon steadiness of hand. The upper body strength is for operating the bow lathe. That's probably the apprentice's job. And the steady hand is to hold the rock crystal still while the carving wheel turns. After some months of labor, you heard that right, months, your uncle's shop might turn out something like this chess piece from 10th century Egypt, which is now in London. But if you wanted something like this, you had to pay top dinar, or like this. Now, the cloisonné setting is 18th century, so try to ignore that and just look at the rock crystal part of this ewer, which is at the Dallas Museum of Art. Very long story, it got there recently. This is a rock crystal ewer that was carved for a late 10th century Egyptian caliph, and it's a spectacular piece of craftsmanship. Its walls are between 2 and 6 millimeters thick. So try doing that without, breaking it. And it also contains an elaborate visual joke. Within each of the spots of the cheetah on the surface decoration, as well as on the links of the chain around the cheetah's neck, there is a mini cheetah that is so small that no modern person had noticed it until my colleagues Jeremy Johns and Elise Morero at Oxford examined it with a digital microscope and, forgive me, spotted it. So asking you or my students or even your uncle to carve a rock crystal ewer is kind of like handing you a Stradivarius and asking you to play a Bach partita. If you haven't devoted a considerable number of hours to practicing the craft on a daily basis since the age of 4, then the results are not likely to be publicly presentable. Hence the need for very young apprentices. But then again, as a medieval Cairene, you're in a city of 500,000 or more, and your uncle's bound to have found at least one person whose father lacked more ambitious plans for him, with hands as steady as a surgeon's, eyes as sharp as a jeweler's, and the strength of a stevedore. Are you ready to settle for ceramic yet? I thought you might be. There's a reason ceramic is a heck of a lot cheaper than rock crystal, even nice ceramic like what I'm showing you now. So those are some of the things that you should not try to do. Cook at home, carve rock crystal. You also shouldn't expect a formal education unless you're male and relatively well off. Now, some women did know how to read and write. Regardless, many women and most men, so basically almost everybody, heard more books than they read, because literature was not really exclusively for reading, it was for listening, and in some cases it was even primarily for listening. So that brings me to the informal education opportunities, which are all around you. For instance, if you happen to pass by a shadow play being performed, you should, if you hear laughter in the background, I'm not sure you can hear that or if that's only on my video, but this is the students who are actually operating the shadow puppets behind the screen. So if you happen to pass by a shadow play that's being performed, do yourself the favor of stopping and watching. The puppets will be made of leather, although the Genizah Lab's shadow puppets are made of paper, and they're held on sticks behind a screen, backlit by torches. You'll be standing in front of the screen with a large crowd at rapt attention, as I was when my students reenacted a shadow play from 14th century Cairo. The play will be staged not in a Princeton auditorium, but in a public square in front of a sultan's mausoleum. And the show will go on despite the prohibitions of scandalized religious experts, muftis, qadis, even rabbis, whose job it is to find such performances morally reprehensible. Which raises the question, are they morally reprehensible? Are they, for example, as morally reprehensible as this 19th century Orientalist painter's depiction of Ottoman Cairo? This is by John Frederick Lewis, an English painter whom his friend William Makepeace Thackeray visited while Lewis was living in Cairo, and described Lewis as a, quote, languid lotus eater, leading a dreamy, hazy, lazy, tobaccofied life, wearing his own orientalizing version of the local dress, which included a, quote, Damascene scimitar. You get the picture. Not quite like that in medieval Cairo. Probably not so much in Ottoman Cairo either. So is this the kind of scene that you should expect? The street theater that you're watching in the 14th century, the question of whether you find it morally reprehensible really depends on your point of view, and also whether you have a problem watching characters who are sex workers, pimps, professional gamblers, thieves, hashish addicts, and God forbid, worst of all, tax collectors. But the Qadi won't be there watching, obviously, so you can enjoy hearing the characters proclaim blasphemies and bawdy jokes to your heart's content and theirs. And I will get back to hashish in a moment, I promise. So if all this sounds kind of salty to you, I need to warn you that the choicest and most morally subversive lines of the shadow play will be in a register of Arabic that's so refined and erudite that unless you've heard or read quite a bit of literature yourself, you won't actually understand it. But if you happen to have spent time studying, I mean, I didn't understand it, and I had to rely on my students who are like classical Arabic literature experts, which I'm not, and they had a hard time too. We had footnotes to help us, but on the street, you will not have footnotes to help you. If you happen to have spent some time studying, or better yet, compiling Arabic dictionaries, you'll be able to follow all the words, because words were to medieval Arabic what tulips were to 17th century Amsterdam. A highly coveted luxury good, a collector's item, and a status symbol. But if you're not so erudite and you can't follow the double entendre, you can go find your uncles and ask them to explain. They'll forgive you the indiscretion because they've been there before you. But you should keep your wits about you, because the audience is likely to be comprised not only of wholesomely curious people like you who are only there for the wordplay, but also individuals as morally questionable as the characters on stage. Now, I promised you hashish, and thanks to Alan Elbaum, hashish there is, in an author who is well represented in the JTS collection. So these are Alan's discovery. He found what he has described to me as a stack of several dozen rhymed Judeo-Arabic pieces in the hand of a guy who calls himself in Arabic el-adib el-ibri, the Hebrew. So adib can be translated as scholar, literatus, cultured person, sophisticate. Adib means all of those things. So we don't know who he is, but we know that he thinks he's pretty sophisticated. He's probably writing in the early 13th century, and he's got some kind of tale of medicine and possible quackery, a second one about musical instruments. These musical instruments, by the way, still exist today, and a third in a more pious vein. And he's also got an 8-pager. This one is not at JTS, but among the Genizah fragments at the Austrian National Library in Vienna, from which a few phrases immediately stood out to Alan. For example, undur ila al-mastul, look at the stoned guy. Huwa shabih al-ghul, he's like a monster, he's like an evil demon. You saw it here first, thanks to Alan Elbaum, the word hashish in Judeo-Arabic. I should mention, forgive me, Alan, but I had to go there. When the pandemic began, Alan immediately decamped to Colorado. So it's not surprising to us that he would find the world's first reference to hashish in a Genizah document. In any case, all this by way of saying that when you go out to consume street theater, there will be people in many different states of mind, perhaps some of them consuming more than just street theater. There will also be pickpocketing. Leave your money pouch at home, minus the few dirhams that you'll need to tip the puppet master, which you should bring with you and tuck into your belt, because it's your job to fill the puppet master's purse with silver coins, just as it's his job to fill your mind with blasphemy, filth, and mirth, provided that it's followed by a wholesome and redemptive ending in which the previously drunken and debauched main character returns to the straight path, finds God and makes the pilgrimage to Mecca, as he almost always does. Once he does, you'll be free to head to the market for a warm supper. But perhaps you prefer a party instead. As it happens, I received a party invitation from Oded Zinger in a register of Arabic that is so deliciously florid that I want to share it with you in some amalgam of his translation and mine. The host is a certain Yusuf or Youssef, they're spelled the same way, El-Ghazafini, who comes from a family of synagogue cantors that is well represented in the Genizah. So we know your family, Yusuf. The host of the party, in other words, is a Jewish communal official from an elite family. And the fact that he's a cantor means that he knows how to use language, because cantors were also poets. So here he's chosen to use language somewhat wittily and wickedly, addressing his friend whom he's inviting to the party formally in the third person as, quote, ornament of the gatherings and crown of the revelers, which sounds like a government title, but obviously can't be. Jamal al-Majalis wa Taj al-Qassafin, as though chief partier were some kind of government issued title. Without his presence, he continues, referring to you, of course, but he's talking to you in third person because he's being formal about it, there can be neither singing nor gathering. Note, however, that alcohol is never mentioned, let alone hashish, but I can't guarantee that it won't be consumed. So this brings us to my last, or maybe second to last question, which may be on many people's minds, which is, has this cantor invited only Jews to his party, or will there also be Christians and Muslims? There's abundant evidence that Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived side by side in the same neighborhoods, and that they did business together, and that they even married each other. And since everyone knows that business and marriage lead to mixed dancing, there's no reason to assume that Jews, Christians, and Muslims didn't also socialize with each other. We have information about business between Jews and Muslim notables, as in this. This is like one of my favorite letters in the Genizah, and I try to use it wherever I can. This is a letter from a Jewish notary or legal scribe, a scribe named Khalfon ibn Menashe or Ben Menashe ibn al-Qata'if. Qata'if are a crepe-like pastry that I highly recommend if you ever happen to be in modern Cairo, and that presumably Khalfon ben Menashe would have recommended as well. He's also the same scribe who wrote the two legal deeds that I was telling you about, the married couple at 16 years removed earlier. But interestingly, here he's writing in a much less formal hand. So he appears to be writing in great haste. I'm going to spare you the entire narrative, and I'll just give you like the short version, which is he is making valiant attempts to get a receipt for the taxes that he's paid on his produce, which might sound boring, and it was very frustrating for him because he went from official to official in a kind of shell game of patronage and bureaucracy that will sound very familiar to anyone living in Cairo or New York City today. But for a social historian, this is like, there is crucial information that we can't find anywhere else in every single line of this letter about the government officials who aren't mentioned in chronicles, and how, sort of a user's guide to government officials, like how did people actually interact with these people when they had to. Jews also encountered Muslim officials in courts of law, by which I mean Sharia courts. That Jews frequented Qadi courts might be surprising to those of you who know that rabbinic literature abounds with prohibitions against taking Jewish legal cases to non-Jewish courts. But the repeated prohibitions suggest that people kept doing it anyway, and that's what we find in the Genizah as well. So here, a widow is swearing in a Jewish court that she is entitled to her deceased husband's property, which she has to do because there was a technical problem according to Jewish law with her marriage contract. So she had to take an oath. So all that is unremarkable. But then when you flip the page, you find two things. An archival notation in Hebrew summarizing the case, explaining that this is a deed about the oath taken by this widow whose name is Aziza. And then you find an archival notation in Arabic explaining that this is a shtar, this is the Hebrew word for legal deed, except that it's written here in Arabic characters, by which the wife of Abul Khair ibn al-Qabila became entitled to her ktubah. Okay, so ktubah, again, Hebrew word written in Arabic characters. She has sworn. So if Arabic and Hebrew script is Judeo-Arabic, then the words shtar and ketubah, Hebrew written in Arabic script, are Arabo-Hebrew. So why? Apparently, this was such a large sum of money. This was an estate that was worth 250 dinars, which is like a gargantuan sum, maybe the equivalent of like, you know, $500,000 today, worth enough money that she wanted not just a rabbinical court muscle behind her, but also Qadi court muscle behind her. She wanted enforcement powers. And if you wanted enforcement powers, then you went to an Islamic court. So that's not even to mention the less savory dealings of a Maghrebi Jewish trader who was caught drinking and carousing with a Muslim woman, for which both of them got into lots of trouble. This is a petition having to do with their arrest, in which we just get like a snippet of the narrative and then it cuts off, presumably when things get even more interesting. The slave, that's how petitioners always refer to themselves. The slave informs the lofty presence, may God increase his loftiness and elevation, of what happened last night in the town, namely that Munajjat al-Dawla, which is a government official title, apprehended a Maghrebi Jewish trader who was with a Muslim woman. They had been drinking together for 3 days in his compound in this noble month of Ramadan. Okay, so now we have Jews and Muslims fraternizing. What about Christians? So this is a letter in Arabic script asking the recipient to procure official documents on behalf of the bishop for the purpose of offering a pair of monasteries legal guarantees for its property. So it's a letter written very formally. I kiss your hand and request that you send a letter to the scribe of my lord, the governor Aziz Dawla, may God perpetuate his support, asking him to get a document from the governor for whom he works, addressed to the protector of the monastery of Minyat al-Shammas, which is a place in the Delta, the bishop Binyamin of Tamwa, may God be his support, regarding the compound in which the property of the two monasteries, Shahran and Hulwan, is located, strengthening the bishop's hand, meaning basically protecting his property. I requested my lord, the lofty sheikh, and this bishop, pious prayers, all the monks, and then we have a lacuna. So basically, this is we don't know who's writing the letter, but we do know that what's being asked for in Arabic is legal guarantees for a pair of monasteries. But it's possible that the recipient who was being asked to negotiate these legal guarantees was Jewish, because if you flip this one over, what you find is the inventory of a shop or an estate in Judeo-Arabic, and of somebody quite wealthy, to judge by the contents. Your day in Cairo is drawing to a close. You've staggered home from your after-hours party and you can unfurl your sleeping mat with satisfaction, but you still have one further challenge to face. When you return from medieval Egypt, your 21st century friends will ask you questions that you may find perplexing, even condescending. They'll imagine that you spent the day in a place that's technologically primitive and religiously fanatical. So you'll have to explain to them with an ostentatious show of indulgence that it was neither, and it's my job to help you make the case. I mean, it's literally my job, because that's what social historians of the medieval Middle East do. And don't be put off by the term medieval. It's not just for Europeans anymore. On the contrary, the more we use medieval for places that aren't Europe, the less people will think of knights and jousting and Chaucer when they hear it. Nor should you worry that by using the term medieval, you might be implying that you consider everything between the fall of Rome and the Italian Renaissance to be a vast, bleak parenthesis, because that's no longer what it means either. In the case of the Middle East, it simply means pre-Ottoman, so before the 15th or 16th century, depending on the region. But have your wits about you, because there are many who malign the medieval period by equating it with barbarism. They're probably thinking of Christian Europe, not the Islamic world, but there are those who malign the Islamic world too. Go on, admit it. You've probably used the phrase medieval torture device yourself without giving it too much thought, or read something recently that referred to quote unquote medieval levels of brutality. Like, I can't tell you how many letters to the editor I've almost written and then not. So let's ponder that for a minute. Are we forgetting, when we talk about medieval levels of brutality, that the bloodiest century in human history was the 20th? Only in the 20th century did humans develop automatic weapons, industrialized incarceration and murder. Totalitarianism, to state the obvious, is a modern phenomenon. All states attempt to monopolize the legitimate means of coercion, and plenty of states are majority stakeholders in illegitimate means of coercion, but only in the 20th century have states deployed industrial technology in the service of violence. Neither medieval Europe nor the medieval Middle East produced anything close to a totalitarian regime. Even absolutism was rarely within the reach of real states, 18th century European monarchies included. Dictatorial powers would have been the wild fantasy of many medieval rulers, but was rarely a reality and never a reality on the scale of a whole kingdom. The population of the planet in the year 1000 was somewhere between 250 and 350 million, depending on whom you ask. So somewhere between the population of the US and Indonesia today, that many people were spread across the entire globe. That means that people were thin on the ground, and communications being slow, controlling people en masse was virtually impossible. There were multiple competing legal systems in most places, many of which predated whatever state happened to be ruling, and many of which also persisted after its fall. People found ways to use these multiple legal systems to their advantage, which is where history from below comes in, understanding how resourceful people were with the means at their disposal. So anyone who equates the medieval period with violence and barbarism hasn't studied our own modern history. It's only in the period before our own, the 19th century, that our ancestors perpetrated myths about the Middle Ages that have tarnished the word medieval. It's a myth that medieval people loved torture devices. In fact, it was 19th century Europeans who were obsessed with devices like the Iron Maiden and the chastity belt, but attributed their existence to the Middle Ages. They did so when many European nation states were rising on the ruins of old monarchies and empires, emerging from what they thought of as the darkness and despotism of the past. Anything from the before times was put into a big box of otherness and labeled medieval. It's easy to disparage people who are long dead and gone and can't defend themselves. That's why I've chosen to defend them, and I hope you will too. I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful, Marina. Okay, I'm going to put myself on the screen with you so that people can see both of us. And people are welcome to send your comments, your questions to chat, and I will pick them up. I just want to begin by saying that with your conclusion, I confess that I was a little bit anxious about spending time in medieval Cairo, but now I'm really anxious, even terrified about spending time in the 20th century, which I guess was part of what you wanted to communicate. I will just set out, this is not a question about your presentation, but about the quality of your presentation. One of the questioners already wants to know where they can take a Zoom class with you. So I'll just lay that one out. But then to the substance of what you presented, there was a question about the dating of documents and how you date them, both when there is internal evidence and when there's not obvious evidence.
Yeah, dating is tricky, and it's really interesting because I've been thinking a lot about the different kinds of dates that historians handle without thinking very hard about it. I don't just mean different calendrical systems, of which there are plenty flying around, and we all have like our favorite online calendar converters, from Coptic to Islamic, from Islamic to Julian to Gregorian, etc. But more than that, there's fuzzy time, there's sharp time, there's uncertain time. There are different kinds of temporal uncertainty. So sometimes you have a date on a document, that's great. Sometimes you have a date on a document, but you can only read part of it. That's less great. And then you can start narrowing down the options if you know some of the people mentioned in the document because they're mentioned in dated documents. Then you have documents where you have absolutely no mooring because you don't recognize any of the names, and there are no dates mentioned anywhere on the thing. So what do you do then? So that's a case where specialists use what's called paleographic dating, dating according to handwriting. Now, paleographic dating is very, very tricky because until recently it was a form of connoisseurship. Basically, like, you show me enough Rembrandts and I can tell you when I see a fake, that kind of connoisseurship. So you show me enough Genizah documents and I can tell you when I'm looking at something that's 11th century versus 12th century. So a colleague of mine in Paris, who's an actual professional Hebrew paleographer, Judith Elshovi-Schlanger, has called all this into question and said, no, we actually need to be much more precise when we offer paleographic analysis of any kind. And one of the things that is now helping us to do that better than we could before is computational analysis, because it turns out that computers can actually identify things about handwriting that we as human beings are certainly perceiving, but we can't necessarily articulate them. So basically what I'm saying, short answer, is a multidisciplinary approach to dating.
Okay, great. There was, I'll follow up a question in a moment, but someone asked about digitization. So here I'll begin the response and then let you complete it, Marina. Virtually the entire Genizah has been digitized. I think it's correct to say. I'm proud to say that we at the JTS Library were actually the first major collection, large collection, to get involved with the International Digitization Project. And it was our cooperation with the Friedberg Genizah Project that actually demonstrated that this work could be done both while protecting the materials that were being digitized and in a way that was efficient, so that all of this is now available online. People can work with it and manipulate it. Would you add anything to that, Marina?
That's exactly right. I mean, you know, for any kind of radical step that you want to take in Genizah studies, if you get either JTS or Cambridge on board, the others will follow.
Yeah, yeah. So we were able to do that, and as I say, we're very proud of that. Someone asked whether, I mean, the specific reference was to the invitation to the party, but whether there's evidence in the documents of socializing amongst women. I don't know if the intent was for friendships or love relationships or both, but you're welcome to respond to that as you like.
So we do have some evidence of male homosexual and homosocial practices from the Genizah. Generally, I mean, homosocial is completely normal, but it can also cross a line, and that's usually when it starts getting condemned. And there's some interesting condemnations of certain parties that happen at shrines. Goitain actually published a wonderful letter to that effect. As for women, it's much, much more difficult to detect. We hear a certain amount of very, very euphemistic and chaste talk about female relatives who are often referred to as, just as they are in the Talmud, right, as the home, and not by their actual names, because to do so would be immodest. And that also means that there's a lot we don't know about women's relationships with each other, but we can piece some things together. I have learned a lot about this from Eve Krakowski. I mean, she's really the authority on women and also girls in the Genizah, and she's really the one who points out that it was the female relatives who made certain key decisions about whom you married and how you married them and what those stipulations in your marriage contract might say. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work that if you do some very, very careful sort of detective-like reading, you can find. And that's what Eve Krakowski has done.
Okay, wonderful. There's a question, I'll give you a couple of them at the same time, about evidence of the Karaite community in Egypt at the time, Karaites being Jews who claimed to reject rabbinic authority and, well, I mean, they rejected rabbinic authority, but claimed to follow biblical authority only and claimed to do it literally. So, you know, that's the one question. And someone was curious about how many synagogues were in Cairo at the same time as the Benezer and what the differences may have been between them.
Let me take the synagogue question first, and then I'll talk about the Karaites. So we don't know, but probably low double digits. Benjamin of Tudela gives us one set of figures. There's another traveler, I can't remember who gives us another, but it's something like 10 to 12 from a slightly later period than what we have in the Genizah. That's believable, given what we know about the size and scope of the Jewish community in Fustat and Cairo, but it's very, very hard to tell because we only have the Genizah from one, possibly two synagogues. And that brings me to the Karaites. So we know an enormous amount about the Karaites of medieval Egypt, an enormous amount. And it's surprising actually how much we know, given that most of what survived from a Rabbinite synagogue. So part of that is because Rabbinite Jews, as they're called when you're talking about Karaites, and Karaites had very, normal everyday relationships. And part of that is that there's another synagogue in Cairo a 15th century synagogue that preserved an enormous, by medieval standards, library of worn books. And that was the Darasimha Synagogue. That's a collection that's now in St. Petersburg, the Firkovich collection, about 16,000 fragments of codices, or not like fragmentary codices, I want to say. What was preserved in Darasimha, unlike what we call the Cairo Genizah, were falling apart books, but they were mostly intact, like maybe missing the first few and the last few pages. Whereas what we have in the Genizah are really like scraps, like they're fragments. It's barely, I would say the surface has barely been scratched of the Firkovich collection. And it's not just Karaite literature. I mean, we have also some of the earliest examples of certain types of Muslim legal literature, because Karaites read absolutely everything. I mean, Rabbinites did too, but it turns out we have a very good sense of what the Karaites were reading because there's a kind of, preserved library from their synagogue. When I was starting out in this business in the mid-90s, I read Leon Nimoy's Karaite anthology with great interest. And the thing about that book, it's great. And actually there's a lot in there that, you really have to dig to find. I mean, he was getting stuff from journal articles and translating in a way that it was understandable by pretty much anybody. However, the book gives the impression that Karaites and Rabbinites hated each other's guts 24/7, 7 days of the week, however many days of the year you have in your calendar. And that just wasn't the case. So what I set out to do in my doctoral dissertation was to see what the situation looked like, again, from the ground up. What would happen if I read all the documents attesting to how Karaites and Rabbinites actually related to each other? And it turns out things were much more complicated, both for good and for ill. I mean, it wasn't like they always got along. Sometimes there was strife between the two communities, but it almost never had to do with religious practice. It almost always had to do with just politics, garden variety politics. The Karaites were very important in the 11th century for deciding who the Gaon of the Jerusalem yeshiva was going to be. And that made them a group of people worth fighting over. So, lots of good stuff if you want to read Jewish gossip from 1,000 years ago.
Great. One of the questioners observes, this I think is a very important observation, and I'm sure you'll have something wonderful to say about it, that the references to God in some of the documents that you quoted from are reminiscent of expressions for God or references to God in Muslim literature, Muslim expression. So what's that about?
Oh yeah, 100%. So there are a couple of different kinds of references. The most striking one, and maybe this is what the person was noticing, is you start every document with an invocation of God. So in Arabic, it would be Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. In Hebrew script documents, you do that in Aramaic. So Bishmach Rahmana is usually how it goes. An invocation that, to the best of my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, David, is not actually attested in any Jewish text until after the Islamic conquests. So this seems to be a Jewish calque from Islam. In the body of letters, you get the same thing. Pretty much, you can't mention somebody's name without blessing them. And all of those blessings are either straight up Arabic or taken from Arabic. And in some letters, including letters of the Babylonian Geonim, they're even written in the midst of a Hebrew script letter in Arabic script, right? So this is how you bless people. Nothing like weird about it.
Okay, that's good. We have a great question here. You talk about kind of social relations, the broad social context. Was there anything resembling a salon in medieval Cairo, in Fustat? What can you tell us about it?
Yes, there was. And we have some really nice evidence. This is the kind of thing where like it's in that evidentiary sweet spot where you actually can expect to find some writing about the salons because it's like literate people, but at the same time, they're not so literate that you've actually heard of them. So it's recovering this whole kind of class of like middling educated people. And actually the authority on this is Mark Cohen, one of my teachers and my predecessor in my job at Princeton, former head of the Genizah lab. He did some wonderful work on how the salons, or majalis as they were called, worked in medieval Cairo. They were often interreligious. So, and sometimes there were even debates about religion, like you have the Jew to argue on behalf of Judaism, you know, the Christian on behalf of Christianity and so forth, just like you would in, say, Yehuda Levi's Kuzari, only in real life, with the understanding that there were no consequences, like if you know, won or lost. This was just all in the interests of kind of theological study.
Okay, great. Anything you'd like to end with? I mean, there are other questions, but as you think about what the questions have been, anything you'd like to reemphasize for us? Or, I mean, if not, I'll say thank you to everybody.
I mean, I just will say one thing about digitization. Digitization means a lot of different things. And the kind of digitization, David, that you were talking about has to do with just the first step of making the photographs actually available to people. There is a form of digitization that is happening right now that when I first heard about it, I literally didn't believe it. And then I was like racing to get involved in it. And that is optical character recognition for medieval handwritten texts. So I'm in the process of trying to see if we can push digitization like one step further and maybe actually, you know, get some Genizah fragments searchably scanned for us by a machine.
Wouldn't that be wonderful, right?
It would, right? It would be like, that would be the Messianic age for me. So watch this space.
Okay. Well, thank you for this absolutely magnificent tour. I'm sure there's extraordinary, I can see from the comments, appreciation all around. Thank you all for attending, and please keep your eyes open for notices from the Library of JTS for other events, including book talks with important new publications. But also in April, we've got a music series coming up. We'll have a play coming up, hopefully in the fall. A lot of things that we will enable you to see online. So thank you for joining us. And Marina, thank you so much. We really are immensely appreciative. Okay, good night all.
Thank you.